So this will be an instruction-heavy session tonight. In other words, if you can bear with me for some full tilt boogie into teaching and really in-depth exegesis of the text, then I'm going to hope to next week, and I'll try to emphasize a little bit of exhortation and how this can encourage us. I'll hope to next week when we get to a quick overview of King David and his relationship to the temple, and Solomon's temple, and then the prophets and their view of the temple. And then really what I want to focus on next week is when we get to the New Testament and Jesus and the church's relationship to the temple. That will hold for us a lot more of, all right, well, what do we do with all this stuff? How does this apply, theologically, doctrinally, but also corporately for the church and individually for each of us in walking with God. So if you'll stick with me for some of the detail we have to go through tonight, and nerdery and sort of language stuff, then next week we'll hit the New Testament running best we can, and we'll get a little more encouragement. Although I'm going to argue, I think there's an awful lot of, every time I revisit this stuff from Leviticus or anywhere else in the Torah, or when you start looking at the whole subject of the tabernacle, I find it just captivating. The deeper you dig, the more you realize is there. And I find that alone encouraging in ways that I find working into my life in ways that at least make me think about my walk with the Lord more deeply. If not, give me mechanisms to live it out. But it takes a lot of digging. So tonight is a digging session, if you wouldn't mind. And I won't review too much. Where we left off was you have on your handout this full list of the offerings listed through Leviticus. As you go through the opening chapters of Leviticus up to chapter 6, you get a list of these offerings. So I'm going to go through one at a time and briefly as I can explain them, and we'll spend more time on some than others. We left off talking about just the concept of, at the very beginning of Leviticus, when you bring an offering. That was important, so I wanted to dig into that last week so we can get a running start at what we're going to look at this week. The language of Leviticus 1:2, it's hard, you don't catch it in the translations, but in the Hebrew, it is the name of the word for a human or humanity, which is Adam. But you could read that as when Adam comes near with I labeled it a near bringing offering, right? An offering that gets you near. What are you coming near to? To God. His house, his throne room, right? He's the king. You're bringing him a gift to his house. We're going to develop some more of that in a moment. But the way that the language here starts, if Adam comes near with a gift to God, that in itself, to me, and I'm going to qualify a bunch of this stuff tonight with, this is how I see this stuff working. It's not the only way it's working. It's not all that it's doing, but it's an underappreciated aspect of this whole ritual system, is that it plays out a ritual drama in narrative form. This is not just a bunch of stuff they had to do according to the way the rituals were laid out in laws. It is a story being told. So the story, when you get to Leviticus chapter 1, in the very opening verses, is a story of Adam making his way toward God with a gift and entering back into the garden. Okay? Now I realize that's a little bit creative, but this is how this symbolic exegesis sort of works. You have to get into an imaginative world, imaginative framework, and think like an ancient person. How would the ancient writer of this literature have wanted you to read these terms? Right? There are other ways you can say, here's what you do when someone brings an offering. Starting it with the name, with the word Adam, and then I'm going to build this argument out a little bit more as we go, but it looks to me like a story being told. And there's other reasons I think this, but just setting us up that way, this coming near to God in the tabernacle for ancient Israel is, in a way, Israel as the new representative of humanity on earth. This is the only people who have this kind of access to God since the exile from Eden. So when Israel has this opportunity to come near, to approach, they are a new Adam, bringing humanity back into the presence of God, back into his throne room. They can make their way back up the mountain and they ascend. And they can go into the garden, the inside of the tabernacle and the high priest's dress, and a lot of the furniture and details are designed to look like garden imagery, right? The tree, the candelabra, as we'll talk about, the lampstand, the menorah, is designed it represents a tree. It's got olive, it's constructed to look like an olive tree. It is symbolic of the tree of life, right? There's all these other sort of little details that make you think back to the creation narrative and to Eden. And I'm arguing, and I didn't make this up, this is a lot of scholarly work that I'm just sort of compiling. But I think it's beautiful and valuable because it's a story of humanity's return to the garden after the exile. They live in a land they're in the wilderness, right? The land of death and impurity and danger, but they're given this opportunity through a ritual system to reenact through a ritual, like a liturgical drama, and all liturgy is drama in some ways. We'll talk about this maybe next week if we can get to Revelation, which is a really exciting place to end up. That's what's going on there. Right? It's all liturgy. It's all temple service being played out on a cosmic scale. And I'm arguing the tabernacle is just another version of that in like a precursor form. So this is the opportunity for Israel to be a living representative of spreading God's life and glory and holiness to the rest of creation and out to the nations. And that's the idea sort of captured in a little symbolic image as soon as you get into Leviticus. Now I know most people don't really read Leviticus that way. They just read it and like, this is a bunch of confusing, strange animal slaughter rituals. But step back and keep in mind what we've been talking about, and you see really this beautiful narrative ritual emerging that works. So think something more like less like a legal code of an instruction booklet or a law code, and more like an opera or a theater presentation, right? Opera is a sort of ritual drama, right? I've never been to an opera, but you go to a theater. You ever been to the theater? We watch movies this way. And to watch a drama performed, scripted, and either sung or performed in some way, you as an observer, you're taking in the media, the form of whatever the media is, whatever the delivery mechanism, whether it's a movie, whether it's an opera, a concert. You're taking in a scripted performance of ritual words and deeds, and you're involved in it just by virtue of the fact that you're watching it, right? And if you're not, you need to watch better movies, or you need to be more cultured. Like, this is what the point is. All liturgy, ritual acts, and speech that are symbolically performed are telling a story. And if you're in the audience, you enter into that story, right? And we know this intuitively. If you watch a movie that has, high drama, or I mean, the classic example of this kind of emotional manipulation that gets you involved in the story is the Pixar, Toy Story. Like, Toy Story 3 is one of the most affecting, emotionally manipulative pieces of work I think I've ever seen. They've mastered the art of making parents totally sucked into these imaginary realms, which we know are not real, right? Leviticus is doing something like that. And if you can start to reframe as more like that than these dry list of rules that don't make any sense to us, it will really enhance just when we get to the details, you start to see what's emerging here. Okay. So that was just the idea of coming near. It's the first two verses of Leviticus are doing a lot of work here. They're doing a lot of heavy lifting to get you into this ritual drama idea. And then it just unfolds from there. And even in these small details, and the translations don't always I'm not saying they're always wrong or even inaccurate, but they don't always capture the essence of what I think is going on, at least in my reading of this. And again, I emphasize, this is my, what I want to emphasize here to bring out more meaning and discover more things from these texts. I'm not saying it's the only way to read it or that's all that's going on. Certainly it's not all that's going on. Every time I come back to this content at all, either from my own personal reading or to study so that I can teach it to others, I'm just convinced I've missed too much already. And I find new things every time. It's amazing. So when you get into these little details, I don't want to make it sound like all these translations are wrong, this is the right way to translate it. Some of that I feel sometimes. Most of the time they're doing a reasonably good job of conveying a meaning, but for our purposes, I just want to draw out that there are other deeper issues sort of hidden in the translation sometimes, or obscured by the way we translate it. And that is not to knock. Most of your Bibles you're looking at right now or have access to are going to be fine to great. It'll do a good job or a better job. Some of them, you could take or leave, but they're all going to be pretty good. I'm not saying you don't have. My Hebrew knowledge is this shallow, trust me. But once you start digging around, you find all sorts of fascinating details. So starting with, just when you start to read up front, in Leviticus, let's just stick to Leviticus 1. I don't have this on we're going to go to Exodus in a minute, but if you have a Bible, look at Leviticus 1 where we just left off. Speak to the people of Israel, in verse 2, say to them, when a human brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring an offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. I'm going to qualify what the burnt offering is, but let me just look at the process here. He shall offer a male without blemish. He shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering. This is the worshiper. He will convey, I think the best way to understand what's going on with this hand leaning ritual is he is identifying himself with the animal. Some scholars will talk about like transferring his sin to the animal. I think that might be something to that. I think it's related. I think it's more of he is placing his identity and transferring that to the animal. And obviously that will sort of absorb the ideas of whatever sins he's committed, he's going to commit to the animal. The reason that doesn't work here is this offering that we're talking about, we'll talk about in a minute, the burnt offering, is not an offering that atones for sin. Right? This has nothing to do with sin. The first three offerings, the first three chapters of Leviticus are not required offerings, and they don't atone for sin. They're not to do with anything to do with dealing with sin. They are gifts you bring to God because you want to, because you choose to. They're completely voluntary. So the idea of transferring sin, I don't think works particularly well. I think it's more about I am the worshiper. I can't go any further than this. And I can't get on that altar because I would like to make it home tonight. Right? You go on that altar, but this animal, I will ritually identify myself with this animal and this animal with me. In a sense, then this animal becomes the worshiper. Does that make sense? Well, again, you got to think.
Almost like baptism. In other words,
yes.
You envision yourself.
It is a transfer of identification. You transfer your identity. You walk in there with this animal, one person, and through this laying on of hands, the animal becomes that person, and he's going to ascend the altar, and what he experiences, some cases a she, what the animal experiences is vicariously applied to the person. Is everyone following me? Now this, again, there's debate about this, and we're not totally certain what this ceremony is doing. I think that makes the most sense. So this leaning ceremony, this hand leaning, and you sort of press it onto the animal. So anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but all these details, again, they start off looking like dry details, and if you ask questions about what's going on here, you get really rich sort of theology built into it, depending on how the answer is best understood. But I think that's what's going on. So the worshiper lays his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Sorry, I just said this doesn't make atonement. It does, but we're going to talk about what that means. It's not for sin necessarily. You didn't do anything wrong that you have to bring this animal, is my point. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord. And that again is the act that the worshiper has to do. You're an ancient Israelite. You're the one who has to cut this thing's throat. That's important and interesting, and we can talk more about that. I'm going to leave that off for now because I don't want to get into too many of these details. But just understand, you're involved in the process. You're committed. You don't just. We're so far removed from this. We don't even kill our own food that we eat. We buy it at the grocery store. So certainly to have an animal that you had to pay for, you had to feed, you had to raise, in some sense these animals would like be in the house with you in an ancient household. You know, they're not all just out there in the field somewhere. You establish not exactly pets, like we have domestic pets, but there's a relationship here, and all of a sudden you're the one cutting this thing's throat. All that alone tells you that conveys some important meaning. Let's just say it that way. You have to do this. Then Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Then he shall flay the burnt offering, cut it to pieces, and the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the altar. And Aaron's sons, the priest, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat and the wood that is on the altar, that is on the fire on the altar. But its entrails and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall burn all of it on the altar. And that's where we get to, sorry, let me go back. Our vocabulary word here to start us off. The verb to burn on the altar, which is what the priest does when he puts it on the fire on the altar, is literally hiktir, to turn to smoke. And I know that sounds like, okay, if you put something on a fire to burn it, that's what happens, it turns to smoke. The reason for dwelling on this is, again, I think, translating this to burn, again, it's accurate, makes sense in the context of what's happening here, but I don't think gets to the goal or the purpose of what this is doing. I think he turns it to smoke actually picks up on what the point of this is. There's a perfectly good word in Hebrew for burning something, as if to consume it, saraf. You know, in Isaiah's vision in Isaiah 6, he sees these seraphim, right? They're basically it's the Egyptian equivalent of cherubim. They're the same thing. They're just one is different context, but a seraphim is called so because it comes from the verb to burn. But a seraph, the verb seraph, means to burn, but it has the idea of consuming, right? The people are bit in Numbers. The Israelites are bit by the poisonous serpents, and they're like it burns them. That's a rabbit trail. You guys make me stay on target here. The word you use to say burn, if you want to indicate it consumes the thing, is saraf, not hiktir. Hiktir means turn it to smoke. What's the difference? If you burn something to consume it, it's gone. The point is to make it gone, right? If your goal is to turn something into smoke, number one, I think that has connotations for what I'm going to argue in a moment is a lot of the idea surrounding this is it creates a meal, right? Maybe this is because I'm a cook and I like to do a lot of barbecue, and the idea of just meat smoking on a fire is just like one of the great joys of life and bringing communities together. But I think one point of this is it picks up the idea of we are making food here, right? More on this in a moment. The bigger idea, I think, is that rather than burning up and to destroy, but rather turning to smoke, is the idea there is to transform. It's a transformation that's happening. So I think that's worth pointing out. And I'm not going to insist that every time you're reading or I'm talking about it, I'll probably make them, it's not a mistake exactly, but I do the same thing. I read it and it says to burn, so you say to burn. Just understand, and it's clunky to translate it, the priest will turn it to smoke. I get that. But that to me captures more of the actual purpose of what's going on here. And so some of the evidence here, look at this. When you go back to Exodus, when Moses is given the instruction for what Aaron is going to do inside the sanctuary, he shall burn, and it's the same verb, fragrant incense. He's talking about the inner altar of the gold altar of incense inside the sanctuary. The idea there is more obvious. What do you do with incense? You don't take your incense stick and chuck it into the fire. You let it burn in a sense of you want it to smolder so that, what's the point? It aromatizes the area, right? It creates smoke, the aroma. That's the point. So if it's the same verb and it's conceptually related. The altar, the bronze altar of sacrifice and the golden altar of incense are related. I'm going to argue they're sort of mirror images of what's going on each, but that's a little bit more complicated. Maybe when we get to Revelation, I'll explain this a little more. But certainly the point of turning something to smoke seems to hold up consistently if you think about what's happening with the incense as the same type of thing that's happening with the animal. You everyone follow you with me? Paul, you got a comment or question on that?
I think God likes smoke. It says right in
Exactly.
Revelation, the prayers of the saints and with the incense.
Yes.
Went up for him. He likes that.
Absolutely. And we'll build on this. So we're building from here, but that's absolutely correct. Some of the idea seems to me is to get God's attention. He likes the smell, like I do, of burning meat. Not burning, like you don't want to burn it. No good chef would burn the meat. But you understand, the incense has a similar effect to the smoke. The goal is not to destroy this thing on the fire, it is to transform it. Right? Let's keep going. That's important. When you keep going on, and this is just in verse 9, Leviticus 1, its entrails, its legs he shall wash with water, and the priest shall turn it to smoke on the altar as a burnt offering, food offering, with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. This is another one of these little details. Paul just hit on this. This is a little bit mysterious, or a little tricky, let's say, to know exactly what's going on, but something like an aroma, a smell that soothes. This leads to a question, and I would say an open debate. I don't know that I would definitively say, here's the right answer, but it does lead to this question, and I'll give you what I think. When it says, oh, this will be a pleasing aroma to God, and therefore he will accept you, are we talking about, in the language here of, it's an aroma that pleases him or soothes him? It's a little wonky to translate. This is as many Hebrew words, has a lot of things it could mean. Do we mean he smells it? Okay, see what we can do about that. Try to reconnect. Does he smell it and then he's pleased? And so therefore it's an invitation that he has accepted? Or are we supposed to read this as he was angry and he smells the offering, he smells the soothing aroma, and the soothing is meant to indicate now he's calmed down and he's not going to attack you in anger? I'm not saying that's an illegitimate reading. I may have not done justice to that reading of it by the way I said it, but that could be a legitimate meaning. I think the first is what's going on, right? I think it's, let's put it this way, more about God being pleased with this invitation, and he wants to take you up on your dinner plans to invite him, or right, you're coming to his house, but you get the idea, right? I think it's more about that than he was really angry and at odds with you, but you cooked him you brought him a nice offering, it smells good, now he's happy instead of mad. I don't want to be flippant about that because people do hold that view, and it gets more to like, is this appeasing the wrath of an angry God? Or is this God is pleased because this is the kind of offering he loves to participate in? I'm going to argue strongly for he's pleased. Just know this is a controversial debate, and it's ongoing. Sorry, an example, and this brings up the question, and you could see how this, going back to Noah, right? At the consummation of the flood narrative, Noah built an altar to the Lord, took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. You see how this story and God's response to Noah's offering and the soothing aroma, the pleasing aroma, can be read in one of two different directions. What did he just get done doing? Destroying humanity because of their wickedness, and it built up to such a point that his only appropriate response was to pour out judgment. I'm not certain, I'd have to go back and look at this. I don't think that's entirely, let's just say if the motivation for the flood was God built up enough wrath because of the people's sins that he had to pour out the flood to destroy them, I'm not sure that's the best way to read it, but it's possible. Either way, you can see how you choose to read what's going on here can shade you one way or the other in terms of what's the best way to interpret this. And I'm still going to favor, he smells the pleasing aroma and he realizes there's one human still I can work with, right? He's pleased at that reality. Like the anger has passed. The anger's already been abated. That was the point of the flood, right? The judgment has already been poured out. Noah did not avert the judgment with this offering, right? Because the judgment happened. And he wasn't going to judge Noah anyway, because Noah found favor in his sight. So I think it works better this way, but again, just want to be cautious. There's a debate. If you disagree with that, we could talk about it. I'm open to being persuaded, and maybe it's a little bit of both. But we'll have to sort that out and unpack more of this as we go. Just to get us into this, you see how this starts to, a lot of stuff needs to be worked out here. Look, by the way, it's interesting going through Philippians on Sunday morning, and in chapter 2, I think we just were in, you have Paul referencing there, he makes reference to being poured out as a drink offering, right? A pouring out of wine, a libation, that usually happened in conjunction with or in addition to sacrifices of animals. In chapter 4, he says this, to the Philippian church, as they have contributed to him financially and helped him in his material need. Philippians 4:18, I have received full payment and more. I am well supplied, having received from Epaphroditus the gifts you sent, a fragrant offering, a sacrifice acceptable and pleasing to God. You see you know exactly where he gets this language, right? He gets it from Leviticus. But you see what he's doing with the language. He's putting this into church life and saying, oh, the financial support you gave me as a missionary church planter and all the apostolic work he was doing, you, Philippian church, that functions as a pleasing aroma to God. It functions like the burning meat on the altar of sacrifice in the tabernacle. That's an incredible little riff he's doing, right? That's a interesting way to think about his life and ministry and his relationship with this church that he planted. This is a remarkable adaptation of these ideas, and we'll see a lot more of this as we keep going. I just wanted to draw one of them out because this was very obvious. Like this one is clear adoption of Levitical language to apply it in a church setting, and I think that's important and interesting. He does it also in Ephesians. Christ himself gave himself for us And Christ was, in his sacrificial death, obviously, the fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. So that would be more familiar to us. But again, you see the idea. He's drawing this directly from Leviticus and the Levitical system. All right, so you have turn to smoke. That's the point. You want the smoke. Why? The smoke is a pleasing aroma to God. All right, great. The first offering you get to in Leviticus that we've been reading about it, it is translated as the burnt offering or something, sometimes the whole burnt offering. Burnt offering picks up something of the process that's going on here, right? Because what they're pointing out with this translation, the Hebrew word is olah. And olah, what happens with the olah is the entire animal is offered. And this is unique. Most of the offerings, most of the sacrifices and offerings, you don't put the whole thing on there and burn it up. You take the what's understood to be the fat parts, it defines it in the terms of like the innards, and those get burnt because they belong to Yahweh. And then it depends on the sacrifice or the offering, but some of the parts would be used by the priests or eaten by the priests. One of them we'll get to in a minute, the peace offering, is shared as a meal, a communal meal. The worshiper would eat part of that, possibly with the priest, but some of it only the priest could eat in a different offering. So the whole burnt offering is unique because the whole thing is burnt on the altar. It all belongs to God. That's the point of it. So burnt offering works because it does pick up something of what's going on here in process. But I think this is another case that overlooks the real emphasis of what is the purpose of the offering, right? How this works, or the process is you put the whole animal and burn it up, so it's called a burnt offering. That makes sense. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm saying it's an unfortunate translation in the sense that it misses why. Why is the whole thing burnt on the altar? And this is easy because the actual Hebrew word has nothing to do with burning or how much of the animal is burnt. The Hebrew word olah means to go up. The point, the purpose of the olah is to make it go up, right? In what sense does it go up? Well, it goes up on the altar. The altar is a raised platform, and again, symbolically, it is a mini mountain. So it goes up on the altar, that's true. But also, when you turn it to smoke, the smoke goes up. I'm going to argue that's more of the point of the olah. So I like an ascension offering as a translation. If I could like Thanos style or be the emperor of the world for a day, I would favor changing all translations in all Bibles that say burnt offering to ascension offering, just because it picks up that one point better, and because I think that's the purpose of the offering, is to send it up, right? So ascension offering, I think, is the best way to think about this. But we're never going to get this accomplished. I would love to see a Bible that does this in translation, but it won't happen probably. So just in your head, when you read burnt offering, just think the going up offering or the ascension offering is a simpler way to say it. And again, I think this matters because there's a theology embedded in this. There's a narrative, a story being told here. What are we doing? What's the Adam, human, doing when he comes near to turn to smoke the animal he's identified himself with, that he hopes will cause a pleasing aroma before Yahweh because it goes up into his presence and God smells it? What is that story? If we translate it all something like that, what's the story being told there? I think whatever it is, it's different than just bring this thing, put it there, burn it, okay, you're good, right? Or whatever, however we tend to think of this stuff. It's really got a lot of richness and theology, I think, and relationship embedded in the way, just shades of meaning different, right, in terms of grammar and vocabulary, but I think, some profound depth when you start to see the story that's being built up here. I found a good example here in Psalm 66. And I translated this. I left the ESV up there in the, that's wrong. This is obviously not the ESV, so I apologize. I don't want to miscite what's going on here. This is me retranslating it from the ESV. ESV does a pretty good job though. I will cause to rise, right? I will cause to rise to you, and then the same Hebrew word is just repeated, the olah of fattened animals. With the smoke, and that's our noun form of the hiktir, the verb to turn to smoke, with the smoke of the sacrifice of rams, I will make an offering of bulls and goats. It's right in the middle of Psalm. This is, again, a liturgical hymn of praise. And you see the point there, right? This captures, again, the purpose of the olah, of the ascension offering. It's to make it go up. And obviously here he's talking about, yes, he's talking about bringing an offering. He's promising to come into the temple and bring an offering for what God has done. He's gonna express his gratitude with this whole burnt offering. But the language he uses is, I will do this. I'm going to make it go up as a going up. I think in the context of the psalm, it's much more, yes, he literally plans to do this, but I think the point is more about in his heart, this is how he feels, right? This is just a way of worshiping God and giving thanks and interacting with him. He's expressing his intention, the depth of his heart, and that will manifest when he gets a chance to make his way to the temple and present his bull or whatever on the altar. So nice little example there. Moving along to Leviticus 2. If you're following along in your Bible, you have these references in your handout. I'm just going to move through the slideshow. Leviticus 2, you get to the next offering, which is the only non-animal. It's the only vegetable offering in the system. And it is grain, the grain offering, typically translated grain offering anyway. Mincha. The mincha, however, probably works a little bit better to call it something like a tribute offering. It's a gift. The grain offering, and again, like grain is not inaccurate. In Leviticus 2, it is certainly grain that's being offered. But again, that describes the material of what's being offered. And I don't think that gets to the point of what's the purpose of it. Mincha gets closer to that point. What's the point? You're bringing a gift to Yahweh. The burnt offering or the ascension offering was also a gift. And these go together in ways that if you read through the chapter carefully, you'll see. The mincha, the gift offering, the tribute offering, can either be for a poor person who can't afford a whole ascension offering, because those things were expensive. This is by far the most costly thing you're going to bring to the temple or to the tabernacle if you're doing this. And certainly not everyone could afford that. The mincha, which is you'd bring a handful of grain, essentially. You bind it with oil, cook it into there's 3 different ways you can cook it. You can griddle it, you can bake it in the oven. In any case, it's an offering of bread, roasted grain or bread. And it can function as a replacement or instead of a burnt offering, if you can't afford one. Very often it seems it was added to the burnt offering. So here is the animal, but here is also my bread, right? Here we have the text from Leviticus 2. The, maybe to this day, greatest commentary on Leviticus that you can come across, if you really want to dig into this stuff, and I'm not exactly making this a recommendation because it's one of those things that's too academic to recommend broadly, but Jacob Milgram, a Jewish scholar, back I think in the late 70s or 80s, he wrote a commentary on Leviticus that is still basically cited by everybody who does any work in Leviticus. It's just magisterial. It's a massive magnum opus, and it's brilliant. So I come back to him all the time. Let me quote from Milgram about this mincha, the grain offering or tribute offering. First of all, he explains that, and I'm just going to paraphrase him here, that the mincha, the grain offering or tribute offering, can either be for a poor person who can't afford a whole ascension offering, if you can't afford one. Very often it seems it was added to the burnt offering. So here is the animal, but here is also my bread, right? The mincha, the gift offering, can either be for a poor person who can't afford a whole ascension offering, if you can't afford one. Very often it seems it was added to the burnt offering. So here is the animal, but here is also my bread. In other pagan cultures around Israel, they would offer things like this too, vegetable, grains, food offerings that were usually some sort of grain or vegetable. But the whole thing was burned. He says in Israel that wasn't the case. And you can read through Leviticus 2, you'll see. The priest takes a little handful of it, and that gets burned on the altar. And it's called a memorial portion. The rest is like cooked and is available as food. So only a small handful goes on the altar and is burned up. And again, anything on the altar belongs to Yahweh. The goal there is to give it to God. That's his food, right? Symbolically, obviously. Milgram points out that other cultures just burned all of it on the altar. Israel didn't. He says that's important because, number one, it wasn't. They didn't give a baked loaf of bread or little cakes or whatever to the deity. Because again, in ancient cultures, in ancient pagan cultures, remember, they are feeding their gods when they bring this food. And his point is Israel intentionally designs this, or God gives them these rituals this way, just to reemphasize the point. This is not food that I actually need. You enjoy it. Now, I think in the case of the grain offering, the priests actually get to eat this. So again, the priests represent God. It is holy food once it's consecrated to them. People couldn't eat it, I don't think. But the priests were the way of like, no, God doesn't actually eat it because he doesn't need it. But the priests would sort of, it was a way to sustain the priests, number one. But also they would sort of, again, in the sort of ritual story being told, is they're eating it on Yahweh's behalf. So they represent God to the people, and the people wanted to bring God a gift. And this meal unfolds. And that gets to the portion here that I want to cite from Jacob Milgram. He says the logic here is that the motivation of including a grain offering, an offering of bread, with all these other offerings which are animal flesh, is because if in ancient Israel you had occasion to eat meat, which was not very common, right? Most people couldn't afford to eat meat regularly, if at all. But if you had occasion to eat meat, it's usually some sort of major feast, right? It's an important event. And that means it's a celebration of sorts. If you eat meat, you also serve bread and wine. So his point is pretty simple when you think about it, and I think pretty intuitive. But he says, when the Hebrew ate flesh, he ate bread with it and drank wine. And when he offered flesh on the table of his God, it was natural that he should add to it the same concomitants which were necessary to make up a comfortable and generous meal. Why give a grain offering in the middle of all these other animals offerings where there's blood poured out and stuff? And this is obviously is a bloodless offering. It's because it's not a proper meal without some bread. Right? That might be oversimplifying what's going on here. In fact, it almost certainly is oversimplifying it. But I think it's a brilliant, sort of obvious insight. This is meant to resemble a meal brought to God, offered to him in his presence, and again, enjoyed in his house. It's really intuitive to me when you think about it. Maybe that's wrong, but I thought it was a little insight that it's the kind of stuff reading through Milgram you get. It just pops out and you're like, this guy's brilliant. Why didn't I think of that? It's just the way you eat meals together. A good host, a nice festal meal. Yeah, you want the meat and the smoke, and that's the part everyone really looks, but you got to have bread, right? It's pretty simple, maybe too simple, but I thought it was an important little detail. So that's the grain offering, or the mincha, the tribute offering. Interesting reference at the end of Isaiah when he talks about this sort of eschatological restoration, this last days restoration when Gentiles will be brought into Jerusalem, brought into onto God's mountain. They will be able to ascend God's mountain. He says, they shall bring all your brothers from all the nations. He's talking to Israel here. Your brothers, Israel's brothers here, come from the nations. This may not be a reference to Gentiles as we think of them. It may be exiled Jews living in what's called the diaspora, right? Living outside the land, but they're going to come back. More complicated topic to talk about are these ethnically Gentiles, or are these Jews outside the land? I'm going to argue for Isaiah's purposes and the vision that's being offered here, it doesn't matter. They were outside, which means they left holy space. They left the land, the Holy Land, and they left the sanctuary. When the sanctuary is going to be restored, Mount Zion will be, above all the earth, and Gentiles will stream up to it, as in Isaiah chapter 2. They come on horses. They come from all the nations as an offering to the Lord, on horses and in chariots and in litters and on mules and on dromedaries, to my holy mountain, Jerusalem, says the Lord, just as the Israelites bring their grain offering in a clean vessel to the house of the Lord. So he compares directly, explicitly. These people brought back in this final restoration, this last day's restoration in God's plan that Isaiah has just masterfully mapped out, is equivalent to what happens when a mincha is brought in the tabernacle, or in this case, the temple. The kind of language that the New Testament will use is this kind of stuff. People as offerings, people as gifts to Yahweh. They are his gift, right? A lot to unpack there, but let's move forward. You get to Leviticus 3, you have the peace offering. The peace offering is called so because in Hebrew it is called a shalomim. You may recognize this is like one of a couple Hebrew words everybody tends to know. Shalom, right? This is just the basic Hebrew word for, it's how you greet people, it's how you say goodbye. It is the word for peace. So it's translated peace offering. I think something like well-being offering works actually really well, maybe better, but it's a little bit clunky to say well-being offering. So peace offering is great, actually. Also, shalem has a wide range of possible meanings, just grammatically. I actually like thinking about this as a fellowship offering. I think well-being works best in most cases. But I like the idea of a fellowship offering. It's an expression of thanks. Again, this is a voluntary offering. You were never required to bring a peace offering. You brought it if you wanted to bring it. And if you read through Leviticus 3, it details some of the occasions, like if you had a child, birth of a child. Oh, you know what we're going to do? We're going to bring a peace offering to God. You were sick and you recovered. Bring a peace offering. You made a vow. This is something that's weird for moderns, but it's very common throughout the Bible and more common in the ancient world. You made a vow. Please, Yahweh, we've got this terrible thing we're trying to deal with. If you get us through it, then he does. You're obligated at that point, but it was voluntary to make the vow. But once you make it, and Ecclesiastes talks about this, don't delay in paying your vows. Then you bring your peace offering, but then it would be called a votive offering, but it's the same idea. It's a shalomim. So it's an expression of thanks for whatever God has done for you. You feel in your sort of soul a sense of well-being. You feel at peace. You feel well. And as an expression of that, you bring the offering to say that out loud to God, as it were, in ritual action. You are thanking God for whatever state of well-being he's brought you to. You're acknowledging that publicly. And this is the only offering that was eaten by the worshiper. So the fat parts and the blood belong to Yahweh, so that gets burned up and or poured out as appropriate. Then the parts that were edible that didn't go on the altar, the priest would break down, butcher out, and they would have like cooking pots right there, and they would prepare this food on site, and it would be shared. It would be eaten by the worshiper, but you're talking usually about a lamb, a goat, right? Fairly large animals for a one-person meal. What are you going to do with all that meat? You're going to share it. So it's usually a sort of communal meal that's in mind here. So your well-being that God has given you, you want to say thank you to him. You bring the peace offering to express that you have brought me to a place of peace. It is well with me. And that creates an opportunity to have a communal meal with other Israelites, other people around you. Often an opportunity, I would suggest, to invite people who were less fortunate, who couldn't afford to eat meat, again, very much or if at all, and to help the needy. And that sense of a communal meal being celebrated together is why I think fellowship offering works really well here, right? So you see how many directions this is working in. You are at peace in yourself, so you bring an offering to God, and that indicates you're at peace with him, right? His acceptance of the offering means it's well with me and I'm at peace with him. And the sharing of this meal with others is a binding together in fellowship for others in the community. So it's one of these things. Which one does it mean and which way is best to translate it? Like, it's all of it. It's just all of it. It depends on exactly the circumstances, and what it could mean is any number of things, and probably it's meant to indicate all of them in some capacity or other. But again, you see how much of this is relational. It is relationship with God. It is binding in relationship to others in an important way. I believe, this is a deeper dive than we have time for, but I believe the Passover lamb in Exodus 12 was considered a peace offering. Now it's interesting there because that is an offering that also protects from from death, right? The blood is applied to the house, and that seems to have the effect of purifying the house, right? From contaminants, from impurity, as we talked about last week. And that mark, or that cleansing blood it becomes the protection for when the angel of death comes. There's always this, or I'd say always, there's very often this idea in all of these sacrifices that either the blood or the smoke seems to be a protective barrier against the imminent death that God's holiness brings, right? If God shows up in his glory, he is holy. We talked about this last week. If you are defiled, right? If you are not pure, you are in trouble, and that trouble results in death. He just burns you up, right? It's a destructive power. The blood of the Passover sacrifice applied to the house seems to be a protective shield, right, against the angel of death that would otherwise destroy the firstborn. You also get a similar effect, and I mentioned this a couple times in the last few weeks, but it's a similar effect when the smoke, right, when the offerings are offered, say, remember Leviticus 9, and the glory of Yahweh comes out and devours, right, and consumes the animal. It's an indication to me that the smoke has been created not just as a pleasing aroma to God, but it also protects the worshiper. Yet the same thing in the sanctuary, in the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, the high priest goes in. He has to light the incense to create a cloud of smoke. And you can read through Leviticus 16. It says this pretty directly. He has to create the cloud of smoke in there because that's the one day a year that those curtains get opened and he walks in. But the curtains are a protective barrier between him and the direct presence of the glory of God. So if you got to open the curtains and go in there, you got to be insane to do that. You don't do that. What's the remedy? Well, in Leviticus 16, apparently it is, create some incense smoke, and the smoke will be a screen, and it says this, lest he die. As if to say, if he goes in there with no smoke, no incense smoke, he dies. But the smoke itself is a protective screen where he can be as close as possible to God's glory presence and not die. Now, you might be thinking, like, how do the physics of that work? How does God not see through this little veil of smoke, right? It's ridiculous. How does that protect him? And the answer is, that's not the point. The point is the story being told, right? The imaginative point. The symbolism of it is God cannot be seen or experienced directly in his glory. But he has accommodated to have some barrier between that allows people as close as possible. And it seems the smoke does that, and the blood does that, given the, depending on the circumstances and how it's worked out here. So while the Passover lamb seems to have been a peace offering, it's understood as a peace offering because it's a communal meal, right? You kill that lamb and you eat it together. That only happens with a peace offering. But it also seems to be a purification for atonement. And the atonement seems to have here the idea of protective covering. Anyway, just a little deeper than I wanted to go on that, but it's fascinating, these details, when you start unpacking them. Yes, go ahead.
When the curtain was torn in half,
Yes.
then we have access to God
Yeah.
in Christ. It's so beautiful.
Oh, we ended last week with this, the idea of the temple curtain being torn in two, and then Hebrews picking that up and saying, yes, that's Christ's flesh was torn, right? His death is the tearing of the curtain. That's not just beautiful. It's sort of mind-blowing when you think that protective barrier between us and God, which is necessary and appropriate, somehow in Christ's sacrifice, he becomes the protective barrier, or he renders it unnecessary, right? However you want to look at it. If you're deep in the Levitical understanding of these things, that shouldn't make sense. And it's like a lot of this, where a lot of the ritual procedures and all of the meaning of this, when you get to Jesus, it makes sense in that it's all consistently funneled into him, right? The meaning is all channeled into Jesus from all this stuff, but in sometimes ways that are surprising. Wait, that shouldn't exactly work that way, should it? And that's a good example. So yes, very much so. That's a good point. Okay, so that takes us through this ritual story being told, and the first three offerings, which are voluntary offerings. Right? These are not the offerings that you have to bring. They were the ones you could choose to bring. Two more remain. That gets into Leviticus 4, 5, and 6. The first, commonly we call the sin offering, and chatat is the basic generic Hebrew word for sin, but it's probably best understood as a purification offering. Sin is just a loaded term, and again, you would need to bring a chatat in cases where you didn't commit a sin, but that you had become ritually defiled. So the point is not always to deal with sins that were committed. The point very often was to deal with purifying impurities that were contracted. Follow me? Like we talked about last week, right? Whether that was contact with a corpse, contact with a human corpse would require the red heifer purification. That's a total different ballgame. But like a menstrual cycle, a contact with a dead animal of some sort that you weren't, a lot of things, scale disease, it's translated leprosy. We won't get to this, but the scale disease of Leviticus with 13 and 14, that's, if you get a patch of skin that just pops out and you're like, what's going on here? Well, it could be that it's a defilement and you can't go to the temple, you can't go into the sanctuary now, or you can't go to the tabernacle to bring your offerings. Those types of things. They wouldn't come about because of sin, but they would require purification. So the purification offering, it decontaminates the sacred space. I'll come back to Jacob Milgram here because this is a very helpful, he illustrates this in a way that's become sort of standard for how scholars talk about this stuff. But those kinds of impurities that you could contract, right, through sexual intercourse, through any kind of bodily emission, blood, semen, almost anything like that. Defiling substances, anything that defiles, if you become defiled, you didn't sin. In most cases, it's possible they overlap, but let's just stick with the basic stuff. If you didn't do anything wrong, but you contracted defilement, once you enter that state, it is thought to be contagious. It travels, right? It travels something like the way we think of as viral infectious diseases traveling, right? It's aerosolized, if you will. All right, remember my pig pen illustration from last week? Remember pig pen from Peanuts? It just emanates. It just radiates contaminants into the atmosphere, into the air around you, into the environment. And that makes its way, it's attracted to, this is Milgram's sort of way of summarizing it, makes its way to the sanctuary. You ever read The Portrait of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde novel? I think it's his only novel. So Milgram uses this as the example. The way impurity works in the tabernacle system is like The Portrait of Dorian Gray, which, if you're not familiar, is this young, rich, attractive man who lives an entirely debauched life of sin and immorality and just no account for anything but his ego and his indulgences and any manner of wickedness you can imagine. He has this sort of cosmic bargain that he will never age or decay. He will always be beautiful. He will always be young. He can attract any woman. But there's this picture, this portrait tucked away in an attic that every sin he commits, every impure act, every woman he mistreats and defiles, everything he does wrong, all the drunkenness, all the debauchery, the picture takes on the defilement. The picture becomes decayed and decrepit. The portrait ages and becomes gross and ugly, but he is always pristine and gorgeous to look at and attractive, and everyone loves him. Milgram says this is the way the tabernacle system of impurity works. People contract impurity, you wouldn't know it to look at them, right? They don't change. No transformation happens that's obvious to the eye. I mean, if the scale disease thing pops up on a visible spot, that would be an exception, but basically it doesn't look like anything's wrong. But what's happened is that defilement has caused the sanctuary to become in some way degraded or infected, let's say, contaminated. It travels. So multiply that out by every Israelite camping around the tabernacle. And day after day, month after month for the year, these contaminants are accruing. They are accumulating near and on and in the sacred space. The sanctuary, the altar becomes defiled. If a priest is defiled, is impure, that travels even deeper into the sanctuary, right? A normal Israelite defiles the altar and the courtyard. The priesthood, the Levites, or Aaron's sons, the priesthood, the Kohanim, they commit these. They transmit impurity as well, but it goes deeper. And the bigger infractions, right? The serious moral infractions, shedding blood, adultery. These things get way into the Holy of Holies. They can actually defile deepest into the holy of all holy places, to the point where if enough of that accumulates, God can no longer dwell there. And he either breaks out and obliterates everybody, or he leaves, which is what you see in the book of Ezekiel, right? In the temple, Ezekiel gets to the point. I think this is Ezekiel 10 and 11, 9, 10 and 11, right in there. He sees these abominations happening in the temple, in the sanctuary, by the priesthood. They have pagan idols in the holy place of the temple. The people have defiled themselves, the priests have defiled themselves, the land is defiled with blood and injustice. And these are so severe, and they've accumulated for so long without being dealt with, that the glory of God just packs up and leaves the temple. And the next thing that happens is Babylon destroys the temple, right? Death is the result. It's not because God got so angry that he decided to kill them all, but it's the same basic idea. The place became so contaminated that he, in his holiness, could no longer dwell there, because those two don't mix. So he departs, and when he departs, the way his wrath is expressed and the way death comes for Israel is in the form of Babylon. They come and destroy. They put Israel to death, i.e., they exile them, right? Think back to Adam and Eve. They are exiled off the mountain, and that is a state of death. And God has brought it about. Really, their sin has brought it about. Their impurities have brought it about. But God, removing his presence, has removed their protection. So when you don't have God's protection, death follows. Right? So If you get too close to God in an impure state, death can result. But if he leaves, death also results. So that's the logic of it. And I think Milgram's example really helps because it frames this again in a framework that we don't often think about, but it really captures what needs to happen. So defilements get all the time, you're becoming defiled, or people in the camp are becoming defiled, and that's no sin in itself, and it's reasonably easy to actually deal with that. Usually it's a matter of taking a ritual bath and changing clothes. Then you are good to go. That is to say, then you can bring your animal, go to the courtyard, and offer your chata'at, your purification offering. But, and this is interesting and pretty important, and again, a point that Milgram details in a really helpful way, it is not the person who's been stained or defiled that needs atonement at that point. You've taken the bath, you've changed your clothes, you're good, right? Even if you did something wrong that was a sin, by confessing it, we'll get to this in a minute with the next offering, but you are okay to be in this, to come to the altar. What you need the purification offering to do is to make atonement to purify the altar itself, right? Or whatever your impurity, wherever it has ended up, right? It's attracted, like magnetically attracted to the sanctuary. It has landed there. So you got to bring your offering there, not so that you get purified at that stage. You're already pure by the fact that you've met the requirements of take a bath, change your clothes, or the time period is up. You're okay. But you've created impurity for the community, right? You've contributed a defilement somewhere in the sanctuary space, somewhere in the tabernacle proper, or more likely on the altar. So you bring your purification offering, and applying the blood is like the Passover again. It is an atonement. It purifies. It wipes away, if you will. Milgram calls it ritual detergent. Again, very helpful. Like it scrubs away whatever impurity you contributed to that place, to the community. So you see right away, that took a while to explain. You see, as you dig these things out, it's not exactly a one-to-one. I sinned, I need forgiveness. I go, it gives me forgiveness for my sin. That's not exactly what's happening. It's a little more nuanced than that. And one of the important reasons to dwell on this is because it's more communal than that. And we, Westerners, Americans especially, we don't think in communal terms enough. When you come to the Bible, you better start thinking that way. They're much more concerned with communal defilements, with communal injustice, with corporate problems that we all cause for each other, right? I will not get started on a political rant here, but we need to start adopting some of these biblical concepts of how what we do and don't do affect the people around us, the community, the church. And that's precisely what's targeted here. Much more than I sinned, I better bring this animal, then I'll be forgiven. It's not quite that simple. I'm not saying there's no element of that, but that's not really what's going on at the heart of this. That is essentially the same thing that's happening with what's called the guilt offering, the asham, but this is a very wide-ranging, asham has a very fluid sort of lexical range of meaning. It can mean a lot of things. Suffice it to say, because we're running out of time here, the asham, I think, is best understood. The guilt offering is fine. The old King James says it's a trespass offering. It's pretty good too. I like the reparation offering. It makes repair. This is an offering, it is essentially a type of purification offering, but it's for more specific, detailed trespasses or infractions or transgressions that have happened. All of these deal with, not all of them. Most of the time these are dealing with something, with an act that was a transgression or breach of some kind that was unintentional. You read through Leviticus 5 and 6, you realize a lot of this is about if you did or said or didn't do or didn't say so and such a thing, but then you realize later that you committed an infraction, then you bring your asham, then you bring a guilt offering. It's much more about making purification when you didn't know you did something wrong, and then you are made aware of it, you realize it, right? So I think I pulled some examples here. Just from Leviticus 6, here's a little example to give you a flavor of this. If anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, like a business deal or something, I guess, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, or has found something lost and lied about it. So they're not like accident. You didn't accidentally do it. Some of these things you did on purpose, but you didn't mean to do harm. You got caught up in it, whatever. Circumstances got the better of you, or you swore falsely, and in any of the things that people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt, and will restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppressing, or the deposit that was committed to him, or the lost thing that he found, or anything about which he sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him to whom it belongs on the day he realizes his guilt. So you did something like this, and bear in mind here, you did it to your neighbor, but Leviticus 6 says it's a trespass against God. They're connected. If that happens and then you realize your guilt, which I take to mean something like you feel guilty about it later, then it's not a simple remedy of, I just get the animal and I go bring the guilt offering and that's good, taken care of. No, what do you have to do first? You have to restore it. You have to repay whatever you did to whomever you did it. You have to restore what was lost and add to it. So you could think of the guilt offering as something more like, in some circumstances, a compensation offering. I like that. I think reparation or restoration probably works best, but you see the range here. It could be any or all of those things. And there's another example where Milgram is helpful. He points out that the actual bringing of the animal, it keeps going, but we got to wrap up here. Milgram points out it's not just the bringing of the animal that really takes care of what's going on here. That wouldn't suffice. It is the process of, let's say, restoration or making repair starts way before that. When he realizes his guilt, the first step is remorse. You feel remorse. You express repentance. And Milgram's argument, and I think this is right, and it's really insightful, is that that's the first step, but then it must be verbalized, right? You can't just say, I really mistreated that person. I feel bad about it. God forgive me. No, you got to go to that person and make it right. When you have expressed remorse and verbalized it, i.e. confessed it, then you can approach God with your animal, and that makes restoration, that makes reparation for the impurity, again, that you've contributed to the sanctuary, to the community. So there's layers to this, there's levels of it. There's the person you wronged, feeling bad about it, confessing it, restoring it, then there's the reparation offering brought to the altar. And this is staged, and it can work various different ways, depends on the infraction, but this is important. I think this is almost precisely where Jesus is getting this when he says in Matthew 5, if you're offering your gift on the altar and you remember, right, it occurs to you that your brother has something against you, that gift ain't going to cut it, right? What do? Just leave it there. It is useless at that point, that stage, unless you go back and first be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer you. I think he's picking up, at least in spirit, and maybe directly from Leviticus, this idea of the guilt offering. You realize guilt. You're there to do the worship, but that's not how worship works, guys. You don't just do the animal, burn it up, good to go. You gotta go make reparation. You gotta repair the problem you caused. In any case, so that is the guilt offering, so-called. That moves you through basically the series. First 3, voluntary. You don't have to bring them basically ever. They are, I want to go to God's house, have a meal with him. Hopefully he'll smell the smoke and it's all good. The second 2 do deal with purifying defilements and sometimes sins, but a lot more nuanced, a lot more complicated, a lot deeper in what they're accomplishing than a typical way of, I need forgiveness, what do I do? You bring an animal to God and he gives you, it's a lot richer than that, as most of this stuff is. So we'll cut there. Next week we'll go into, get ourselves into the New Testament and see if we can wind this whole thing up and make it all apply to our lives in some way. So thanks for sticking.